Hi students, today we are going to discuss about arrangement of tiny particles in the three different states of matter. In the previous class we discussed about what is meant by matter, then three different states of matter like solid, liquid and gas. At last you studied each substance is made up of tiny particles. That means the basic unit of a matter is tiny particles which cannot be seen with our naked eyes. From this class we are moving on to how these tiny particles are arranged in the three different states of matter. Okay, look at these pictures. These are the cross sections of three different states, that is solid, liquid and gas. And here this small circle will indicate each tiny particles. Each circle means each tiny particles. So these are the tiny particles in the three different states. And here you can see three characteristic properties of the tiny particles. That is distance between the tiny particles, attractive force between the tiny particles and the freedom of movement. Movement between the tiny particles inside the three different states. Let us try to analyze how these characteristic properties varies in the three different states. Okay, the first case, that is distance between the tiny particles. You can see in the solid substances, the adjacent tiny particles are very close to each other. So, there is less distance between the adjacent particle. That means the distance between the adjacent particles will be very less. So, they are tightly packed. But in the case of liquid, you can see a small distance between the adjacent particles. Not much as tightly as solid. And in the case of gaseous substances, you can see the adjacent tiny particles are separated by a large distance. That means the tiny particles are loosely packed. Then the next property, that is the attractive force. We know that the adjacent particles inside the solid substances are arranged very close to each other. So there will be a very strong attractive force between them. Here the adjacent particles are very close to each other. So they are attracted very strongly. As the attractive force become very strong, the adjacent particles are come close to each other and they become tightly packed. But in the case of liquid states, you can see a small distance between the adjacent particles. So there is a considerable amount of attraction between them. Not as much as in the case of solid. So the attractive force in the liquid states will be very weak. And in the case of gaseous substances, we know that the adjacent particles are separated by a large distance. So there is no force of attraction acting on the adjacent particles. They are very loosely packed. So the attractive force will be very weak between them. Then last, the movement of the adjacent particles. In the case of solid substances, we know that the force of attraction will be very strong between the adjacent particles. So they cannot move freely inside the solid substances. That is, the freedom of movement will be very less in the case of solid. But in the case of liquid, we know that there is a weak force of attraction between them and there is a small distance between the tiny particle. So they can make small movements. They can make small movements inside the liquid substances. And in the case of gaseous substances, we know that there is no force of attraction between the adjacent particles. So they can move freely on either side or upward, downward, etc. Movement will be very large. So by considering the variation of these characteristic properties in the three different states, we can define solid, liquid and gas. We know that solid behaves as rigid substances. Why? Because the tiny particles inside the solid substance are very close to each other. There is a strong force of attraction between them and the freedom of movement will be very less. So they behave as rigid, tightly packed. Okay. Likewise, we know that liquid have the property to flow. Why? Because there is a small distance between the tiny particles, so the force of attraction will be very weak and they can make small movements between the tiny particles, so they can flow. And we know that the gaseous substances can easily spread in the atmosphere. Why? Because the force of attraction between the tiny particles will be very less or no force of attraction between them. So the adjacent particles can move very freely. So they can easily spread in the atmosphere. Okay. So at the end of our class, we can conclude that the arrangement of tiny particles in the three different states. And we define the properties of solid, liquid and gas. Okay. Thank you.